Hello plant lovers and welcome back to my channel. Hello plant lovers, thank you for finding me. In case you wonder, I post every week about orchids that I grow and have some success with here in Melbourne in Australia. And today someone left me a message asking what are some of the ways to actually grow your collection in terms of the types of orchids to buy in terms of their size. And I thought, what a great question, because I had exactly that same question when I began buying orchids and kind of didn't know what I was looking for or looking at. So plant lovers, buying orchids 101. So firstly, let's get to some climatic details. I am in Melbourne in Australia, which I will show you here. So climatically, it can be described as cool Mediterranean, warm temperate. You know, these things tend to fluctuate, but essentially we have cold, wet winters that don't freeze, and we can have warm to hot, dry summers, which can also be cold and wet, but if that's any help. Sometimes described as equivalent to zone 10 in the USA and parts of southeast England. It really depends on the coldness of your winter, I think. What that means is the orchids I tend to look for are ones that are described as cold, cool, intermediate, sometimes warm growers. And I guess the other point for me to make is that I only grow my orchids in a natural environment, so either indoors or outdoors. I have no equipment, so no growing lights, heat mats, humidifiers, greenhouses, heated outdoor areas, nothing. You either can survive inside or you can survive outside or get out of the pool. Again, that will limit the choice of things that I'm able to buy. And that, plant lovers, often limits the choice of what is available. So let's start from the very beginning. And firstly, you might know all of this, so forgive me if I'm boring you with things that you already know. But one of the first questions is that notion of the clone. So a cloned orchid is literally a tissue sample that's taken from a parent and it's reproduced. So the young plant is genetically identical to the mother plant, which is not that dissimilar to taking a cutting of a plant in a different context. And what it means is you're going to get a plant that's identical to the original one. And that's largely about the flower. If you grow something from seed, as Darwin intended, variation could occur. So you couldn't really guarantee that the seedlings were going to flower in the same way as the parent plant, because who knows what sort of pollination, nefarious activities went on. So that's the kind of the two differences essentially. And as far as I'm concerned, there is no difference whatsoever. The only thing is with a seedling, you can't guarantee 100% that the flower is going to be identical as the parent. Unless, of course, it was grown in very sterile conditions. But anyway, you know what I mean. Okie doke. So if you're looking at seedlings, it is a great, and let me bring these examples up. It is a great and inexpensive way to start your collection. This is a seedling that I bought commercially from a seller in Australia. They are usually around $8 to $10 Australian, so really inexpensive. That is really a great way to experiment if you're not sure if something's going to thrive in your environment, or you're not sure if you're going to like it, or any of those questions. It's not such a big risk. For $10, you can take a punt and see if it survives in your climate or not. This is how they arrive. That plant will probably be a year or two old perhaps, and I always repot them the minute I get them. And this one is a Miltassia. I've had a bit of luck with Miltassia, and this is called Royal Robe. It is a beautiful deep red, so hopefully that's going to thrive for me. The first thing I always do with my seedlings is repot them. As you can see, they will arrive in sphagnum moss, and this I have repotted in an orchid medium. And this is one of those intergeneric Cattlianthe mega mixes. It's called Tutankamen. Has the most amazing red burgundy flower. So if I can get that to flower, plant lovers, watch this space. I'll be making the biggest video on earth because it's so glorious. But look at that fabulous new shoot. So it's very happy. This seedling may be a year or two old, and it could even conceivably flower next year. Who knows? It might still be a little young, but nonetheless, seedlings are a great way to buy orchids to develop your collection. The only problem is, of course, patience. It depends on the orchid type. An Oncidium could flower within the second, third year. A Sarcocollis orchid, Australian type, can bloom in the first year. Others could take 5 years. So it really depends on the orchid type and your patience. So mixing it up in terms of the maturity of the plants you buy might be a good idea, but seedlings are a great way to experiment, take some risks, but also they are so easy to ship. So if you're buying them online, which I tend to, this particular seller sells them in a plastic tube, so it's like a little mini greenhouse, so they can survive kind of all sorts of vagaries of the postal system, so quite practical. Now a seedling came from a flask. Now, I didn't know what that meant when I first saw it, but what it essentially is, it's a sealed glass jar where the seeds of the orchid are sprinkled on a growing medium and then it's sealed, so nothing can come in. It becomes its own microclimate. The seeds germinate, the plants start to grow, and it just becomes a tangle of roots and green. And often the sellers are online and you'll see the flask photographed and it just looks like a jar of onion leaves sometimes. But sometimes on searching for particular sorts of orchids, the only option I've seen has been to buy a flask. Now, flasks are not inexpensive because often they are the rarest sorts of orchids. So depending on the orchid type, but it could be 50, 60, over $100 Australian. So expensive. And I decided that I was desperate for an Anguloa clowesii, I think that's how you pronounce it, which is a fantastic cold, cool growing orchid with the most amazing yellow tulip-like flowers. Couldn't find a plant anywhere for months and years and weeks and days that I looked. So in the end, all I found was a flask. I bought one, didn't manage it very well, sole survivor. But the sole survivor has got a great new lead shoot, as you can see, and a secondary shoot coming up. So I think I've managed, but all the others died. The mistake I made was this. Now, when you buy a flask, it is deflasked, usually by the seller, and they then transfer that tumble of roots and leaves into a plastic jar, which they then ship to you. And what you need to do pretty quickly is then pot that up. And what I failed to do was to do that immediately. So I left it sitting for about a week. Not a good idea. Then I potted them individually in the little plastic tubes with sphagnum moss, but as I said, strong failure rate, one sole survivor. Anyway, I didn't give up, and I've got this, which hopefully will flourish. Recently, plant lovers, I bought my second flask, and this is Lycaste skinneri. Again, a cool growing orchid, beautiful pinkish flowers, which are fragrant. Again, couldn't find an individual plant. Bought the flask, not inexpensive, but I ended up getting 11 plants. So what I did firstly, when it arrived, it had been deflasked into a plastic container. I then just put that whole rooted contents, without dividing them, into a pot of finely chopped sphagnum moss. Kept it in moderate condition, so not too bright light, not too dry, not too wet. So, you know, just nurturing it after its traumatic birth and journey. And then a month ago, I potted them up individually. Now, all of these, I think, are doing reasonably well. There's some really great shoots from some of them, as you can see. So, you know, I might have 100% success rate from these, we'll see. The benefit is then, if you've got 10 or more plants, is that you can trade or sell some of the others, so you kind of can balance out that initial outlay. But often, to buy a rare or unusual orchid, a flask might be your only way to go. Just do a little bit of research first to make sure you don't kill them all like I did. Okay, from flasks and seedlings to what would be described as a flowering size plant by a seller. So essentially, this is a seedling that the grower has kept on for 2 to 3, 4 years, and the plant hasn't flowered, but it should be ready to flower in its next flowering season. Now, this is a Masdevallia orchid. This is, again, a cold, cool growing orchid that loves the climate here in Melbourne. It lives outside all year, and this hasn't flowered yet, and a little bit more expensive than buying a seedling, but not crazily expensive. So let's say between $10 and $20. And this one, I'm pretty confident could flower this year for me. Now, Masdevallias flower in winter, late winter, and that looks to me as though it's big enough to start blooming. So there we are. Again, flowering size or sort of mature seedlings are probably the most common size of orchid that you're going to find on sites such as eBay. Which brings us to the point of, where do you buy orchids from? So here's the gamut for me. I'm in Melbourne, which is in southeastern Australia. Most of the orchid growers in Australia are in Queensland and New South Wales, which is the tropical part of Australia, subtropical and tropical. So it's not that easy to actually go to an orchid specialist here in Melbourne and look at orchids and talk to the grower and buy them. There are a few cold specialists, but they're not close to Melbourne, so it's actually quite difficult. So for me, the place to buy orchids in the flesh, as it were, is garden centres and flower shops that are specialists. But again, they don't have them all the time, and they're not the grower, so you can't have that kind of one-on-one chat with someone and find out all the details. Anyway though, after your flowering size specimen, the next size up would be flowering. Now, this generally would mean it's the first time the plant has flowered. It's still fairly young, but it's mature enough to bloom. This is a fabulous orchid that I bought from a plant shop, literally because I'd never seen it before. It's stunning. I did make a video about this, which I'll link below, and this is called Brasada Mavada. It's again one of those intergeneric megamixes, which is just stunning. So there you go. Flowering orchids are kind of the next size up in terms of buying. Obviously, you know exactly what you're getting. And depending where you are, they might not be named properly. This was just called Oncidium Alliance, which always sounds to me like a subplot from a Star Wars film. Not Oncidium Alliance, but anyway, that's the swings and roundabouts of buying them. The other thing about flowering orchids in shops is that when the flower dies, the plant tends to be discounted. So it can be quite an inexpensive way to get a large flowering size plant that you should be guaranteed of getting flowers from next season. I haven't repotted this yet, plant lovers, because the bloom is still very happy. So when it stops flowering, I will repot it in terracotta. Now, where else can you be buying orchids from? So obviously you can go to shops that specialize in them. If you're in a part of the world where there are growers, great place to go because you can talk to the owners and find out the information. Otherwise, there is online, or clubs and organizations which have growing tables and swap meets and that kind of thing. And for me, I would say most of my buying has been online. So if you can find good orchid suppliers that you're happy with, stick with them. And then there's eBay. I don't like bidding on things because I just like to know what the price is and buy it. But eBay obviously is the place to sometimes find rare and unusual ones. It depends where you are and what type of things are available in your neck of the woods. Now, after the flowering size, the next thing we have is the division. Now, division is just as it suggests. It's a mature plant that has been divided by the owner. This is a species Oncidium. So species means that this is as the plant occurs in the wild. It hasn't been hybridized. And this one is called Sotuanum, and it has got 2 flower spikes, ta-da, which I am very, very excited about. I'll do a video about this when the flowers open because it's supposed to be amazing. But back to this point. The thing is about divisions is that you're getting part of a mature plant. So it should, in principle, flower in its next cycle. Of course, that can depend when and how it was divided, if it was stressed too much, if you take care of it well enough, if it was in transit for too long, if it was divided and not shipped immediately. I mean, there are so many variables. For me though, this came from a seller that I bought things from before, and they tend to specialize in species orchids, so I really trust them. But as you can see, this is the old part of the plant here, the old pseudobulbs at the back, and as it's an Oncidium, it sends growth out from the front. So the thing about getting a division is you want to make sure that you've got a viable part of the plant, not the back dead old bit. You want the bit that's going to have nodes to be able to produce new shoots. You kind of can't tell. So can be tricky, but you are guaranteed of flowers, and it's kind of a good way of kickstarting your flowering collection. Not that easy to come by though. You don't often find them online, so you're probably more likely to get a division from a friend or someone who might belong to an orchid club, which is something that you would probably find online or Facebook Marketplace, that kind of thing. So not that easy to come by. Often, depending on the source, quite expensive, but the benefits are, you know, its flowering size. The negatives can be, you kind of don't know what the health of the plant could be. And if you bought it sight unseen, you kind of don't know that you've got a viable part of the division. So it can be a bit fraught, but if you know who you're buying it from, great way to extend your collection. And then lastly, here we are, my Sarcocollis hartmanii. That is buying a specimen plant. So a specimen plant would be one that is years old, maybe 5 to 10 years old, that the owner has owned and loved and is then going to sell. So for that reason, not that common and quite expensive. And this one I actually got from they're called in Australia a trash and treasure sale, like a flea market, a car boot sale basically. And it came from a seller who had lots of Australian native orchids in really mature sizes and not that expensive. But I've never seen that seller again and never seen such large size plants for sale again. So moral of the story is, if you do see something unusual or fantastic or a great size that you won't see again, jump if you can. There are lots of things that you will always be able to buy. All the popular orchids you can always find in flower shops and online in various sizes. But the more unusual things, if it comes your way, if you can, try and grab hold of it. So buying a specimen, again, not that common. Some of the weird places I've seen them though are house clearance auctions. So here in Australia, often plants are included in a clearance sale of a house. So if you have a look at weekly auctions in your neighborhood, if they do include plants, that is sometimes an inexpensive way to get really big examples of plants. It's often things like in Australia, those cymbidiums, but nothing wrong with that, to get a really great big flowering example that you wouldn't be able to find otherwise. And the other place would be from orchid groups, societies, and things like Facebook Marketplace again. So growers who are willing to swap mature examples for other mature examples. But yeah, not that easy to come across, but great way for instant maturity and flowering, obviously. I made a video about this as well, which I'll link below, and it is coming into autumn now in Australia, so these need to start getting a bit more sunlight to start promoting the growth of the flower spikes, and this baby always gives me at least 5 or 6 flower spikes covered in blooms. It's fantastic. There we are, plant lovers. How to grow your orchid collection from the flask to the seedling to the flowering size plant to the flowering plant to the division to the specimen. Thank you to the suggestion for talking about where and how and what to buy orchids. Because yeah, I didn't know any of this myself either when I first began. I was sort of struggling my way to figure out, what does it mean when someone says a flask? What does a mericlone mean? Anyway, I figured all that out a little bit for myself. I hope this has been of use to you. Many ways to go, and all of it will depend on where you are and what's available. But yeah, good place to start taking inexpensive risks is seedlings. Try and find a seller that you trust and who's willing to share their knowledge, because that always helps as well. So there we are, plant lovers. Thank you for watching. I post every week. Next week, who knows what, but it'll be something fabulous, I'm sure. I hope your orchid collecting and growing is going well, and I look forward to seeing you next week with something equally as fantastic. But until then, take care.